Western civilization might hang in the balance with. This is the seed of a genocide. George Floyd marked the beginning of a full-blown cultural revolution, and the techniques they were using with the identity politics, the woke stuff, were Maoist. These tyrants of the 20th century, they're playing the same playbook to form a society-wide cult. There are people who are blamed for all the problems in society. The whole point is to divide the population into the good people and the bad people, and to get them to fight each other.
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture.
What exactly do you mean when you say the woke right?
It's people who claim right-wing values who act like woke left. They use the cancel culture, the bullying, the smearing, the collectivism, the victimhood orientation, the conspiracy theory. When you look yourself in the mirror, do you really see this as everybody who's not fully on board is a problem?
Western Civilization, Maoist-style control, and a society-wide cult. James Lindsay doesn't just warn about the ideological takeover of our institutions, he names it for what it is, a cultural revolution unfolding in real time. And in a provocative plot twist, he argues that these tactics aren't just being deployed by the woke left, but increasingly by what he calls the woke right. James is a mathematician, author, and cultural critic, best known for exposing the philosophical roots of wokeness and the way critical theory, identity politics, and authoritarian tactics are reshaping the West. In this episode, we explore how pandemic-era control measures, institutional capture, and media-driven psychological operations have fused into a political weapon, one that both sides of the spectrum are now wielding. We unpack the religious and Gnostic underpinnings of this movement, why the same playbook as 20th century tyrants has been run again, and how it's dividing and re-engineering society from within. Now, before we begin, we really need your support to keep the show alive. We've just launched our 1,000 member campaign to bring together 1,000 supporters, each chipping in from just £3 a month, so that we can keep bringing you conversations just like this, without censorship and without corporate control. Please join us today at danastingregory.com/donate to support us. Now get ready. This 2-hour deep dive discussion with James Lindsay will challenge your thinking and give you a different set of lenses to understand what is happening in our world right now.
James, good to see you again. Last time you and I were together in Geneva in, I think, May 2024, tackling the impositions of the WHO, the IHR amendments, which unfortunately will probably, by the time this is released, will be in force in most parts of the world, despite our efforts. And I think we actually sat together at dinner on the final night, but I was so wiped out and zombie-like from months of preparation for that event, I cannot remember what or if we talked about anything at all. So delighted to be here today and have a full conversation about something that I'm deeply interested in. I want to start by recognizing that you were one of the earliest voices warning about woke ideology, full stop, and that it wasn't just a misguided set of ideas, but actually a dangerous set of ideas. What do you think you saw early on that most missed that enabled you to clock what was going on?
Well, as usual, I'm going to sound crazy in the next few minutes, but I'll tell a little bit of the story. I mean, my journey to understand what woke is goes back a lot further than most people's. I probably had my first shocking encounter with woke thought long before we had any name for it. Obviously my first encounter entirely was I was at this I went to a bar, frankly, and I had this weird situation where sometimes it happens where you have like your work friends and then you have your friends from other walks of life. In this case, I was training martial arts, and some of my martial arts friends and we all, for whatever weird reason, ended up at the same bar at the same time. One group was going out and the other one said, "Hey, where are you?" And, the groups are together. So I have these kind of white collar academic, literally academic. I don't know what collar they get. It's not even white. But, the academics, a lot of whom were, feminists and so on. And then I have these kind of roughneck martial arts, blue collar guys, and I'm the monkey in the middle. And so the conversation goes as it does, and everybody's mostly getting along and everything's kind of fine. And then the blue collar guys get griping about something going on at work. And in particular, it's their boss, and their boss is a black woman who runs the floor in this factory, which is a big smelter. So it's actually a dangerous place to work, unless safety standards and protocols are all adhered to. And so they're like, she's going to get somebody killed. And they're all talking about how much of a problem it is. And somebody says she's an affirmative action hire using that language. And one of the academics flips out. You can't say that. That's racist. And the guy's like, no, really, it's not. She's an affirmative action hire and she's going to get somebody killed. She doesn't know what she's doing. She should not be running a floor with this kind of machinery and these kinds of things happening. And this turns into this whole argument. And I step into the middle and I say, well, to this academic woman who's now incensed. She's a, radical feminist. She's incensed that this is happening. She's actually a social justice warrior. I just don't know that yet. And I said, you're always so interested in hearing everybody's stories. He's telling you a story. Why is his story not important? We should hear his story too. Maybe they have a perspective. And she said, he's a white man. His story has been told. And that was my first kind of shock into something different is going on here. This isn't actually, as advertised. It's not about hearing stories that, people aren't hearing and trying to get to right answers about things in the world. This is something different. And I didn't think too much of it, obviously, but it was shocking enough to stick in my memory. So years later, I get involved in all of these discussion forums, philosophy, writing with Peter Boghossian. I think we're mutual friends. I don't know. And we're getting attacked for being sexist. Everybody around us is being attacked for being sexist for all these different things that don't make any sense. So, third wave radical feminism, we called it, kind of became the problem, which was morphing into the social justice warrior problem on college campuses. Peter worked at a college. I was very interested in the atmosphere on colleges because they're such strong knowledge producing and credentialing institutions. And so we were looking at this and it was just this kind of meltdown, 2013, 14, 15, very early on. And so Peter and I step into this space rather boldly. We did this series of hoax articles testing academia and testing peer review to see if we could flatter their ideological convictions and publish either horrifying or absurd nonsense. And we were very successful. It's called the Grievance Studies Affair. I'll kind of skip the details of how we got to that and what it was all about. But we ended up getting 7 papers accepted for publication in peer-reviewed journals, some of which were leading in their subdisciplines. And this became quite the scandal. But in the middle of this is the kind of, I'm about to sound like a crazy person story. One of our papers was about education. And the idea was that some people are privileged. They have whatever, white privilege, male privilege. And I could tell 100 stories about how I encountered people hitting me with the, well, don't you have privilege card up to this point? So privilege has become this whole thing. Peter and I even wrote an article saying that privilege was the left's concept of original sin and that it gave an entire Augustinian framework to the woke phenomenon. I had given a talk about this at Portland State University with Peter, that it's an Augustinian framework. In other words, there's an original sin and we all have to go to kind of constant confession to kind of get through it and to atone for it. And at any rate, this paper is about some kids have more privilege than others. So what we're going to do is find a way to grade them in terms of their privilege. We'll have them do the privilege walk or some exercise, and then to find out how privileged they are. And then what we'll do is we will do what's called a progressive stack on the classroom. So the more privilege you have, the worse you get treated. The less privilege you have, the more opportunities and advantages you get in the classroom. We're going to stack the classroom according to privilege. And we suggested things like abusing the students as an educational opportunity, but we'll do it with compassion, to make it kind of funny but over the top and all of this stuff. And by the way, this idea of progressive stacking a classroom was real. There was a professor at one of the universities in Pennsylvania, I forget which one, maybe UPenn, who did this in her classroom. And she got in trouble for it the year before. So Peter and I just took our inspiration from the news and decided to argue forcefully for this idea. And the peer reviewers are the ones that changed my life and made me sound crazy, because they wrote back, we love this idea. However, they said you have the right idea, trying to overcome their white fragility and all of this. So we were ahead of the curve on Robin DiAngelo. We wrote this in 2017 at the end of the year. So nobody knew who Robin DiAngelo was for about another year, or really until 2020, but she blew up in 2018 in left circles. But nobody knew her when we did this. We found her original academic papers. And so we got told this is the right idea, but you can't use compassion, because we thought it'd be funny to say they were going to abuse kids with compassion in order to get them out of their privilege. And they said you can't do that because it threatens to recenter the needs of the privileged students. And so what you have to use instead is this thing that they call the pedagogy of discomfort, which had been written about by a woman named Megan Bowler in a book called Feeling Power, which we had not heard of. So we had to go find Megan Bowler's book and read chapter, whatever it was, 8 on the pedagogy of discomfort. And the idea is that you put the learner, in this case, we'll say kids, but the learner, into discomfort about their state of privilege and leave them to sit in it. And I thought, my God, and here's the crazy part, this ends in genocide. This logic ends in genocide. There are people, due to their, accidents of birth, who are blamed for all the problems in society, and we have to re-educate them out of the status that they have as a result of this. And compassion can't be on the table, but discomfort and, abuse are on the table. I was like, the logic of this ends in genocide. So I came out and said, this is the seed of a genocide, which you would think that people would understand how seeds work. Everybody's seen seeds. Sometimes they sprout, sometimes they grow, sometimes they flower, sometimes they fruit. But every one of those stages, there's a sometimes. It's not like, we're there. I never said this is a genocide. I said it's the seed of one. This logic ends there. And I actually sat on that for about 3 weeks. And I went and asked my wife if I could quit my job and dedicate all my resources to studying and exposing woke, because I figured I had a little bit of a head start in seeing what I was seeing. And I would have a little bit of a platform after this project came out. The Grievance Studies Affair gave me a spotlight. So I knew I'd have a spotlight, and I knew I had a head start. So I created the company that I run to this day, which is called New Discourses, which literally exists just to put out for free as much of my research as I can do as fast as I can make it. That's the only purpose of it. It's entirely crowdfunded. I run it like it's a nonprofit, and it's not a nonprofit. So I have no donors. I have nothing of this. I just run it to get the information out there as fast as possible. So I dug in. I just started studying woke kind of from the front end, this academic literature being published in the last 5 years, working backwards. So I guess I started from the back end, which is now, and worked backwards, trying to kind of do an academic archaeology of what in the world is this? Where did it come from? And how did it take over? And of course, there's also, well, what do we do about it? But my primary objective was, what in the world is it first? How are you going to, I read this book one time, a long time ago, and it says there's this Polish proverb. I think about it all the time. I quote it all the time. I say it all over the place, all over the world, which is never attempt to cure that which you don't understand. So my goal was, we better get the diagnosis right, because this is, all the chips are on the table here. Western civilization might hang in the balance. We got to get this diagnosis right.
A quick pause to share something important. The future of this show is under threat, and the only way we can keep doing this is with your support. We recently launched our 1,000 member campaign, where our goal is to bring together 1,000 listeners willing to chip in a small amount monthly to keep the show alive and thriving. Even just £3 a month, the price of a coffee, makes a huge difference to us. And as a member, you'll get access to our private supporter community, early access to all of our episodes, invites to live recordings, and the knowledge that you're helping to keep bold, uncensored conversations like this going. So if you believe in what we're doing, please take a moment right now to join us at danastingregory.com/donate. Let's keep the show alive. Now back to the show.
So I just set to doing the diagnosis. And so I started reading all the literature backwards. Many people know that I wrote a book called Cynical Theories. Cynical Theories explored the postmodern dimension of this and touched on the critical theory. After Cynical Theories came out, I went deep dive into the critical theory side. I wrote a book about critical race theory called Race Marxism a couple years later, a year later, I guess, a year and a half, explaining the critical theory side of this whole story, and as part of the buildup of what critical race theory is. And then I've dove into the rest of the dimensions since, while my research, what I think is interesting, is tracking backwards into those original sources and peeling back the layers of the onion to figure out still what this really is. I find all of their documentation now to be extraordinarily boring and repetitive, because I've read thousands of articles and they all say roughly the same thing. But that's who I am and what I am. And that's why I got into this, and how I became this kind of front runner is I just started noticing it. And I didn't leave it alone, right? I started to, when the feminists started coming after Peter and I and calling us sexist way back in 2014, I just went and read their articles to find out why in the world would they call us sexist. I was like, I actually asked feminists, I don't know what you're talking about. Please send me things so that I can, get up to speed. And I started to read their literature and get my head around it a little bit. And I was like, oh my, this is a problem, And so one thing led to another. And it's always been this, how do I look deeper? How do I get this diagnosis better? But the big turning point in the story is that peer review coming back saying that you have to use discomfort, not compassion, in order to educate people out of privilege, which is the right idea.
Gosh, man, that is so wild. It's so wild. I want to just move around the timeline a little bit to help us navigate this. So you started this, 2013, did you say? 2013?
Yeah, that'd be kind of when I started really noticing that there was something to look at here.
Yeah. And I think a lot happened between 2013 and 2025. And as you were speaking, a couple of things came to mind. Firstly, I'd completely forgotten about social justice warriors, SJWs. In the UK, our government has recently spent millions on rebranding the website, which basically involved moving like a dot on .gov, which was a complete waste of money. Probably one of the worst rebrands in all time. But as social justice warriors rebranded to woke, like woke became like the rebrand in a way. And it felt like the social justice warrior subject, the topic of it, maybe it was so heavily critiqued that it morphed. Well, what actually happened between that peak social justice warrior phase and now where we are today? What's happened in that kind of 12-year period?
Well, on the early end, the campuses kind of went crazy, but the short answer for how the rebrand became woke is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter came onto the scene after the death of Trayvon Martin, which would have been late 2012 or early 2013. I forget exactly the date, but roughly that same time period. But it was kind of small and, some people knew about it, but not a lot of people knew about it. But after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which is part of St. Louis, greater St. Louis, that was the hands up, don't shoot guy who was charging the officer, hands up, don't shoot. And so after that, Black Lives Matter, that was the very end of 2014. And then the activism was mostly through the year of 2015, including, blocking highways to airports and things in summer of 2015, never in winter, just in summer of 2015. So Black Lives Matter actually became the organization that transformed kind of the picture. So you had this period of time, and it wasn't really until 2019 and 2020 that the word woke sort of became the word. But what happened is that the people on the left obviously did not like being called social justice warriors. And so they branded themselves as woke, and as sort of a African-American slang term that taps into the idea of what used to be, hip. We're hip to the jive. We're hip to the power of the white supremacist society. We're hip to the racism in the police, or we're woke to all this. So they started to very briefly through the late 2010s brand themselves as woke. But this very rapidly got captured and turned into a pejorative. So the sane general population, plus especially the right wing, captured this term and started to apply it as we had SJWs before. But there's one thing that I've learned as far as just PR goes is that the fewer syllables you are working with, the more likely a concept is to catch on. If it has a hyphen, it's never going anywhere. If it has a prefix like neo, it's never going anywhere. Neo-Marxism is much more confusing than Marxism, even though it's basically the same thing. So woke is one syllable. It's easy for people to say. It's easy for people to identify. It even has that feeling like that it fits as a pejorative, right? I'm woke sounds super arrogant versus you're woke sounds, like what's wrong with you? Like you think you're better than everybody. So it has this valence to it. So woke stuck. I was looking back through some of my old tweets trying to figure something else out the other day, maybe 2 weeks ago by coincidence. And I happened to notice that I started using the word woke instead of critical social justice late in 2019. But what happened was Black Lives Matter popularized the term on the left, and then the right took it over. And then obviously the big turning point was not 2015 and the kind of campus madness with some street activism that died down. 16, 17, 18, 19 saw a lot of anti-Trump activism, but they didn't see a lot of, you didn't see a lot of specifically woke activism until George Floyd died. Actually, the lead up, starting in 19, you started to have this kind of drumbeat coming out of the media of not terribly sympathetic, but allegedly sympathetic black people who got shot by police, unarmed black people who got shot by police, usually for doing something pretty antisocial. They got papered over by the media. And then George Floyd becomes the ultimate example of this. Of course, you have this video with, the police officer, Derek Chauvin, with his knee down on the guy's shoulder blade. He's screaming, "I can't breathe." Looks like he's being choked out to an untrained observer. He's crying out for his mama. I mean, it looks bad, right? It looked really bad. Of course, nobody knew at the time that he was had a lethal dose of fentanyl in his body, but and was actually suffocating because of that. But at any rate, here we have this, video. It blows the thing sky high. The whole world changes basically, literally overnight, to a full-blown cultural revolution. And the people that were doing it were at that point were both calling themselves woke and were being called woke pejoratively. And then, everybody I think is fairly familiar with this issue, at least off in the distance, if not right in their faces, from 2020, summer 2020 forward. Of course, that coincides with the COVID pandemic lockdowns, which was a big eye opener for people because you couldn't go out and protest the lockdowns. There were people that were protesting for gun rights here in the United States, and they were getting shut down. You can't protest. There's COVID. We'll all die. It'll be a super spreader event. Everything was a super spreader event that they didn't like. And then all of a sudden, whoops, racial justice is a loophole. Racial justice is more important than global pandemic that we had to shut down our economies for. And the contradiction showed up in people, they registered. And so you had this sudden shift to saying something weird is going on, something bad is happening. And after that, I became very popular. I had spent the previous 9 months, based on the story I already told you, writing I just happened to decide to study critical race theory in greater depth first. So I had written basically an encyclopedia that you could call an outsider's perspective on critical race theory over the previous 9 months, and published, I don't know, probably over 200 pieces on the issue. So all of a sudden, people are looking for answers, and I had this gigantic reservoir of at least suggestions toward answers. So I blew up. But what happened effectively, in my opinion, was that George Floyd marked the beginning of a true full-blown cultural revolution. I didn't know at the time to use that language is very powerful. I didn't know at the time. I wish I had known years earlier that the motif of the Cultural Revolution, I vaguely knew that it was a Mao thing, but I didn't know the details. And so I didn't know it was a cultural revolution for sure. Although looking back in 2020, I was saying that it was a cultural revolution. I just hadn't taken seriously enough to go study Mao and find out what that entails. And so what we were seeing, and this is the really neat part, kind of, and there's some crossover for you and your audience, is that the techniques they were using with the identity politics, the woke stuff, were Maoist, but the techniques that they were using with the COVID control mechanisms were also Maoist. The whole point is to divide the population into the good people and the bad people, and to get them to fight each other. And the people in the middle are supposed to see the bad people getting piled on and the good people getting rewarded, so they'll join the good people and punish the bad people. So when we saw in COVID, that they were like, we needed 100% of the population to get vaccinated. It's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Our president said that. Joe Biden said that as president. It's going to be a long winter of disease and death because of the unvaccinated. This scapegoating of the people who weren't going along is the same scapegoating that I was talking about with the privilege thing before. It's the same tactic. And when you actually look at how Mao organized his various purge campaigns, including the Cultural Revolution in 66 and 67, you see the exact same signature. It's exactly the same play. I call it now the politics of compliance, and I've spoken about it here and there around the world too. It's a very serious issue, but now, I just have this explanation, but that's where woke jumped onto the scene and went from, it canceled out the negative term social justice warrior, and it, gave them a label, which then got taken away from them and used pejoratively against them. Although Kamala Harris, even in her presidential campaign last year, even had this video near the end, so very close to the moment, saying it doesn't matter if you're more woke or less woke, just be woke, but try to be more woke. So the Democrats here, at least in the U.S., embraced this term unironically, even under the fire of everything, all the way up to the end. But so I guess that's a long taxonomy, but that's kind of what happened over the course of the last decade. Key thing being that a cultural revolution was launched, and we've put up one heck of a fight against it.
So there's a couple of things that I want to draw out here that kind of will help stem the conversation to this idea of the woke right. So this might seem like an odd parallel, but I think there's relevance. We were running a workshop last night on the state of the financial markets, and we shared the Wall Street cheat sheet, which basically looks at the emotional psychology in the financial markets and how, slowly it builds from post-crash into despair, this despair energy. But then as the markets start to rise, it starts to move into belief, optimism, and then it goes into thrill and then euphoria. But the speed at which it goes from the initial despair, which I'm kind of in my mind placeholding like the origins of woke and where that begins against something, an awakening. But then over time, it kind of picks up momentum. But then very quickly it goes from belief, when it hits optimism on the cheat sheet, the Wall Street cheat sheet, then it skyrockets to euphoria very quickly, and madness sets in at euphoria, like irrationality. People are chasing like moonshot gains in the market. They're doing silly things, and often that's where people lose money. The reason why I'm asking if this is a parallel, because it feels like in a way there's been a slow burn, which is why I'm curious between what happened between 2013 and 2025, because it felt like a very rapid acceleration of the idea. But was there any fundamental shifts in the ideology? Did it change? Because one of the arcs that I've noticed that may be a parallel when we look at this through the lens of the woke right is that this initial awakening, which then becomes somewhat ideal or awareness, I suppose, first and foremost, an awareness of an issue of some kind. But then over time, it becomes ideological and then finally dogmatic. And I'm curious whether, the 2012, 2013 period was kind of when it was ideological, and then it kind of accelerated in the way that, we see this Wall Street thing go into euphoria, and it takes it into this very religious, like dogmatic. Was there any fundamental shift, or has it always had those elements since its origin?
The answer to your question is both. Both things are correct. I think that you're reading it right, that it was more of kind of an ideological disposition that became extremely dogmatic later. But the ideology, as I've traced it, which I'll characterize it slightly differently than you do, the ideology's always been this wildly dogmatic. The thing is the wildly dogmatic ideology has not been very popular. And so I think what happened primarily was that starting in 2012, and there's every reason to believe that starting in 2012, if you look at any of the graphs that, the Google N-word, or whatever it's called, graphs where they show how popular a word has been, how many times it shows up in searches or in articles or whatever else, virtually every so-called woke term, white fragility, white whatever, anything, all skyrockets starting in 2012. I mean, you have this exact curve that you're kind of describing. And there's a plausible argument to be made for a couple of things that happened in 2012. One is, again, Trayvon Martin died. And if you recall, the way that President at the time, Barack Obama, responded to this was by saying that Trayvon Martin was the son he never had. So he kind of set this issue on fire. This racial disparity issue got set to blaze with that comment. And I mean, having lived in America through the time, it's definitely the case that happened. And then, of course, Trump was framed out when he ran for president and eventually won as this existential threat to everything, which he still is framed as this. It's asinine at this point, but even your country, Canada in particular, now New York City, Minneapolis, and our other Democrat cities in the U.S. are all just losing their minds over Trump, which is a very weird thing at this point to lose your mind over. But at any rate, that was a major accelerant. And so what I perceive has had happened is that the very intolerant ideology started to filter in very gentle ways that became more and more rigid over time, using these kind of major touch points, whether it's Trayvon Martin is the son I never had, and his 2012 campaign, Barack Obama's 2012 campaign being very, very identity politics driven, unlike his 2008 campaign, whether it's frankly, I have to mention this, the amendment or the modernization, they called it, of the Smith-Mundt Act in the United States, Smith-Mundt Act prohibited certain amounts of propaganda, military propaganda and intelligence propaganda being used deliberately on the American people by the American government. And then the modernization of that to deal with social media that they passed in 2013. A great deal of the intelligence community's propaganda techniques were cleared to be able to be used on people, particularly through social media. Social media is also rapidly on the rise in terms of its influence on everyday people. So there's structural elements happening. But then, my big touch points are then the election of Donald Trump after that, and then George Floyd. Just was this kind of rocket ride besides the drumbeat from the media, whether it's Michael Brown or whether it's, Breonna Taylor or any of these other cases of the allegedly unarmed, therefore innocent black person being shot by white police, therefore because of racism being the set of assumptions that they threw out. So there was this kind of arc of acceleration to where I noticed, like I said, the difference between 2012 or 13 when I was out with my friends being kind of shocking to through 2014 and 15, campuses were absolutely insane. That's when you had Nicholas Christakis getting screamed at Yale for not making it a safe space for his, students or whatever. That's where you had like people flipping out that a conservative speaker like Ben Shapiro, like not that controversial, would show up and speak at a university and they're outside screaming at the wall, throwing trash cans and chairs, absolutely losing their minds. So the safe space microaggression thing all explodes. That's all 2015. So you're starting to see this massive shift in the kind of younger people. And I think that's downstream from the educational prerogatives that had kind of taken over, that were teaching this ideology as though it were truth. As a matter of fact, critical pedagogy is the name for that. And critical pedagogy through the early 2000s, 2005 through 2015, basically, started to deeply instantiate itself in the not hard sciences, everything that's not hard sciences in the university teaching system. So our college students started to get pre-radicalized, or as its originator, Paulo Freire, called it, conscientized to a critical consciousness of reality. And so they became woke, basically. Their education program was woke, was making them woke. The media was making them woke. The social environment they were in was making them more and more woke. Everybody had to hate Trump or else that's making you more woke. We have to resist. We have to wear a hat and go on a march. Whatever it is, it was, full tilt, temperature up all the time is a perfect storm of radicalization. And so people radicalized, I think. The ideology itself has always been this dogmatic and intolerant, but people radicalized into it through the 2010s. And so it's a similar story to what you said. And at that point, they went fully nuts. Although it's almost a negative nuts instead of a euphoric nuts, right? They wanted to tear everything down. They wanted to tear down Donald Trump. They wanted to tear down American history and the statuary, whether it's Confederate soldiers on the one hand or Thomas Jefferson and George Washington on another. Of course, you had the same problem there in the UK. And, this became absolutely mental. Like once George Floyd died, it was a frenzy for a year and a half. I mean, literally a year and a half, it was a frenzy. And so I think that that's kind of what happened. Now, the thing is when you walk these roads, it's hard to come back, right? As you radicalize, it's very difficult to admit that literally you went nuts, right? And for what you thought was a good cause that turned out to be a bad cause, there's a lot it takes to kind of overcome that. Deprogramming your way of thinking can take actually a couple of years on average for people who do decide to step back out of that kind of mindset. It's a very toxic thing. They call it a mind virus. I don't know that that's the best analogy, but it's not a bad analogy. So I think that that's actually what happened during those years was that the radicalization took advantage of certain touch points, especially through the media, while the education system was increasingly committing itself to these. Then in 2020, everything switched on a dime. It wasn't a corporate option. It became a corporate imperative. It wasn't an educational option. It became an educational imperative. And on down the line, everything was, Donald Trump can never happen again. The racial justice problems out of control. We have public health threats that are beyond our capacity. So we need global governance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And everything tried to change all at once with tremendous speed, more than even tremendous force. The speed made it almost impossible to deal with. Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah, I mean, it's a blur looking back. I mean, I think Matthias Desma's work would be very interesting to look at on this lens. Mass formation, he's applied it obviously to the pandemic, but But really what you're describing as you were speaking, it sounds like cult formation, because again,
It is.
in a cult, people it takes a while for people to have awareness that they're in a cult. And then secondly, once even they have awareness, there's such group dynamics that prevent you from therefore taking any form of action to exit the cult.
That's right.
And there's all of these cult-like dynamics that have played out in the way that you've described.
Yeah, so what Lenin and Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler, to a degree Franco, but certainly Mao, and then all of these characters that we've been dealing with, whoever they all are, we could blame Klaus Schwab if we want at the World Economic Forum, we could blame Tedros Ghebreyesus if we want, we could blame a lot of people. Whoever these people are, a lot of it's CCP directly, they're playing the same playbook, which is effectively what they figured out, these tyrants of the 20th century. What they figured out was, given the technology of the time, how to form a society-wide cult. So we're thinking of people in weird robes with weird religious practices. We might be thinking of Jim Jones, or we're thinking about the Moonies, or we're thinking about the UFO cult people. Lots of different things when we think of cults. But what they figured out was how to do this at mass scale. And I mean, again, Mao, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, these characters. And the technological leaps that we've had since, the communicative leaps that we've had, everybody now even might be aware kind of the dynamics. I don't think they are, but they might be vaguely aware of what Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or the Maoist People's Republic did. But cults today are online. The cult phenomenon now happens on the internet, and it can spread extremely widely, extremely rapidly through, videos that are taken out of context or that are provided in correct context or anything else. Reflexive, that's George Soros's term for his technique, is reflexive agitation, where what we call it a lot of times is the current thing. Everybody has to talk about the current thing all the time. There's usually only one or two correct ways to talk about the current thing. The one correct way is the obvious correct way, and everybody gets bullied not for following it. This is cult dynamics. And then the other thing is when you have two correct ways you're allowed to talk about it, and either of them are fine as long as they're in conflict with each other, which then strengthens your commitment to each of the two positions. And by the way, that actually presages the woke left, woke right phenomenon. So it is cult formation. It is cult formation at mass scale using social media and broadcast media and education. Unfortunately, education should have been a stopgap in this, but had already been co-opted to the project. But primarily mass media and social media combined to create a propagandizing circumstance that the likes of which the world has never seen.
A quick break to tell you about something really important. It's becoming increasingly difficult to speak freely without fear of being silenced. With the UK's online safety bill now in force, surveillance powers are expanding and censorship is only accelerating. That's why more and more people are waking up, and Proton VPN just became the #1 most downloaded app in the UK Apple App Store. It's built by CERN scientists based in Switzerland and fully open source. Proton VPN is one of the few privacy tools that genuinely walks the talk. When another big name VPN rejected us for misaligned values, Proton welcomed us because they support real free speech. So head to danastingregory.com/Proton or hit the link in the show notes to find out how you can protect your privacy and support what we do. Now back to the conversation.
And the techniques they employed were the same kinds of techniques that these terrible tyrants of the 20th century used in order to create society-wide cults, whether for communism, fascism, or National Socialism.
Well, yeah, I wanted to touch on that because a lot of the examples you gave, it felt to me, were either far left or Marxist in kind of origin. To what extent are they defining characteristics of woke ideology? Is it by necessity that wokeism is defined by Marxism, or is that kind of a partial function?
It is more yes than no, but this is a tricky thing because reaction exists. So I noticed this a long time ago. I used to talk about this even when I was in college before I was in any way politically active, the idea of rebellion, right? And so when you decide to actively rebel against something, maybe it's your parents, right? You're sick of your parents controlling you. You're just tired of how they've got their thumb on your life. So you're going to rebel against them and do the opposite of everything they want. Your parents are still controlling you, right? Rather than doing everything they want in the positive direction, you're doing everything they don't want in the negative direction, but you're still being controlled by the set of wants that they have. And reaction works the same way. So the examples of what I would give is woke. Woke is not left-wing or right-wing. And if we go back before Marx in particular, and look at some of the philosophers in Germany who I would say channeled and created what became the woke ideology, particularly Hegel, to a degree Kant, but also, Schiller and Schelling and these other guys that were down in Tübingen. This is a woke way of viewing the world. Hegel had a woke view of the world. There's this grand idea out there. It's this perfect idea, and that we can approximate it. And then we go through this kind of tumultuous, conflict-oriented process that allows us to go through a series of social and intellectual revolutions that give us a new idea that's closer to the grand ideal, perfect idea. This being, and then it's instantiated in the state, of course, the statism is there. But Hegel wasn't left or right. Hegel had two groups of descendants after he died that were called the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians. The young Hegelians produced Marx and Feuerbach and these guys. The old Hegelians, on the other hand, are much less known, but they basically believed that the Prussian state, often, imbued with either a particular strand of Protestant faith or imbued with a particular strand of Catholic faith, is already the perfect state that needs to be basically a world empire, which then starts to resonate with the Nazis. But if you look at Mussolini, or you look at Franco, or you look at Hitler, they're very clear that they based what they were doing off of Marxism while rejecting Marxism. So they're basically saying, we're not going to go with you. We're going to do the opposite of you, but by the same mechanisms and the same control. So the right side of this is, so the question ultimately was, is woke, leftist or Marxist in its origin? And the answer is that even with the fascists were a reaction that was derivative to Marxism. Without Marxism, you don't get there, right? And so they were copying the Marxists for their, as Hitler phrased it, for his own firm convictions. Right. And he even said before he took power, Hitler even said explicitly that the National Socialist program was based on Marxism, but improved. So he took out several of the conclusions he thought were fanciful. Mein Kampf is primarily about how much he thought was fanciful and idiotic in Marxism. And he took the same motif and built a different program out of it. He thought, for example, that a deep nationalism bound in ethnic identity was necessary to make the socialist project work. So this grand international, everybody, is the same egalitarian project of Marxism is crackpot. What you need is an ethnic nationalism or ultranationalism that will, be able to create enough of a bond to get people to want to share with each other. So the answer is a little complicated, but it's Marxist, but it can also be like the bad reaction to it, right? It's a bit like getting the flu. If we call it a mind virus, that's a virus. The flu is a virus. A lot of times people who die from the flu don't die from the flu virus itself and what it does to the body. They die from the cytokine storm that the flu virus brings upon them. So your cytokines are a series of signaling chemicals that operate in your body to signal your immune system to come up. But they're what cause fever. They're what cause a lot of the awful sick feeling. And a lot of the times you can get so many cytokines flooding your system at once in a desperate attempt to get your immune system to kick up that it can kill you. And so the cytokine storm itself can be the thing. And so in a sense, the metaphor is like leftism becomes the intrinsic virus, and then reaction, whether you call it fascism or reaction or woke right or whatever, it becomes like the cytokine storm. So I'm just trying to pull analogies. But yeah, the quintessential idea of woke actually transcends left and right completely. And this is where I think I lose people, because they see it as intrinsically left. And then I say what I just said, which ties it to being intrinsically left. And then, well, how do you have a reaction? I think that metaphor helps. But the fact is that woke itself means that you woke up to the hidden truth about reality being a system of power controlling everybody, and that there's people who are privileged by that and others who are marginalized by it. And there's an intrinsic conflict between the privileged class and the marginalized class that defines the march of history, which will always end in one of two ways: the revolutionary reconstitution of the society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes, which is the quote directly from the Communist Manifesto explaining this logic. Again, so derivative to Marxism. But I think that the woke idea is, I've called it, going again before Marx, looking at Hegel, looking at Kant, looking at Schiller, Schelling, Rousseau, even Cromwell to a degree, looking back at the Puritans, looking back at these earlier examples, Rousseau in particular, being the person that I think instantiated this. I've referred to the whole phenomenon of what I call woke as sociological Gnosticism. So it's this secret, you've awakened to a secret knowledge of how society really works. It's basically a gigantic conspiracy theory that the people who benefit from the conspiracy are all somehow brainwashed to support it. The people who don't are the only ones who can see it. So they have to bring war against the existing power dynamic in order to try to liberate mankind from his, evil political demiurge that's keeping him down. That's what I see as woke at this point. I can nuance this further and make it more intrinsically left, because what we call woke is ultimately something called critical constructivism. So it's adopting critical theory for a constructivist view of the world. The right is only semi-constructivist. It doesn't believe entirely that the world is what we perceive it to be, and therefore that perception precedes actual reality, and that power therefore precedes perception. It contours how we perceive the world. So the woke right is only semi-constructivist. It's not fully constructivist. It's not everything is socially constructed, but they still have the element of the socially constructed architecture by the conspiracy of power, whether it's the managerial elite, which is kind of the theme that they use now, or whether it's, the bourgeoisie or whatever else.
This is where I think if we were to just capture that one paragraph you just said about this, the secret knowledge about the power structure and its oppressive nature upon society. If there's one thing I've observed during the course of COVID and the kind of pushback against the likes of the Great Reset and whatnot, it's the same energy which you've just described. And there have been several times where I've had that realization about that dynamic. I've never labeled it in the way that you have, because I think it's important. This is why I wanted to go on this kind of like historical unraveling, so we can get to the genesis of what woke really means. Because unfortunately, I think what's happened is now when you think of woke, you almost think of somewhere in between that. And you're absolutely right about single, not decibels. I've lost my, I said I was tired. Woke is easier to say than SGW. It's
single syllable.
Syllable's the word decibel. But it's characterized by like the screaming libs of TikTok, brightly colored hair. And by the way, when I was a teenager, I had blue hair, red hair, silver hair. I mean, I was wild. But I never had a meltdown, even when my local football team lost to our local rivals in the playoff finals. Never once had a meltdown of the biblical proportions that I've witnessed on those caricatures. But in many ways, it has become mimetic. It's become like a caricature, and it's got visible symptoms of being woke, visible outside recognizable features, which are cult-like in their manifestation. They always tend to have, again, the media's helped to create this because it's created a generalized stereotype, but as a result of that, that's then proliferated. But as a result now, when anyone on the right thinks about woke, they probably see that kind of shouty, screaming liberal and think, that's not who I am, therefore I can't possibly be woke, and I can't possibly even have woke ideas. So before we kind of segue here, could you then, through everything you've shared and discussed, what is it that in your mind, I mean, you may have already answered it in that one statement about how one sees the world, but what is it that really defines wokeism? Is it a worldview? Is it a method of control? Is it a pseudo-religion? Is it all these different theories you talked about? Because, critical theory certainly belongs to the left. So unraveling all the things you've studied, let's define explicitly what wokeness actually is, if it isn't what you just shared a moment ago.
Well, it's everything. It is what I shared a moment ago, but it's also everything you just said. I will correct you that critical theory is not necessarily a creature of the left. It just was developed as critical theory specifically by the left. Critical theory is a specific, I shouldn't correct you too hard, because critical theory was created by the leftist Max Horkheimer very specifically, and the Frankfurt School, which was a leftist school of thought. So yes, but there's a broader school of critique, which could also be generally called a critical theory, not the critical theory, but a critical theory with the non-definite article. And the reason I bring that up is that these gentlemen that I refer to on the woke right have explicitly tried to recover it. I'm actually making their argument here, that there's a broader tradition of critique in the kind of German sense that, again, young Hegelian, old Hegelian, it's not limited merely to the left. But critical theory, I should correct myself, was specifically a left-wing phenomenon. And having a critical consciousness is the general expression. This is a very technical term, but is the general expression of what it means to be woke. And what that means is that beautiful paragraph that, AI will be able to transcript for us later, which is that it is the belief that there is an intrinsic power structure that's defining of society. That intrinsic power structure is, in fact, a conflict between privileged and marginalized. The power structure itself does the marginalization, but it's upheld by the people, usually outside of their knowledge, but to their benefit, who are inside that structure. And it is therefore to be exposed and attacked, usually through critique only, negative attack only by the people outside of it. The usual expression, which Max Horkheimer himself gave for the critical theory, is that it's not possible to articulate a better society on the terms of the existing society. So you have to step outside of those terms and at the same time critique the existing society for those aspects that are not what you would want to see. So that's where on the left, it's everything is problematic. On the right, they have a different set of kind of moral underpinnings. So it's everything is degenerate or everything is somehow corrupt. They have slightly different views that are actually very important, but they have that same intrinsic structure to their thought, which is that there is a society-defining power dynamic that privileges some people and marginalizes others, which intrinsically puts both of those groups, privileged and marginalized, in a conflict that defines the movement itself of history. And so you'll hear it whether you read it from Marx or whether you read it from Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Hitler or Mussolini. They all have said this. Man is a historical being. What that means is what I just said. You are part of this intrinsic conflict that defines the movement of history. And so you can't be located outside of your history. There's no such thing as man being outside of history. We're all part of this intrinsic Manichaean conflict, or Manichaean, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I've only seen it in writing. Conflict of good versus evil with no in between. This polar, which by the way, that was one of the Gnostic cults. This polarized view of reality. So it doesn't matter whether you adopt right-wing motifs or values or left-wing motifs or values to get there, or to express that, I should say. You get there by waking up to it, hence woke. But it doesn't matter how you express it. So with like the purple-haired screeching, lesbian or whatever it is that we all think of as woke on the left, and therefore the kind of avatar of woke, what you see is them transgressing the boundaries of normalcy in society in a particular way. And what you see on the right is that because their values are different, they're not trying to, open things up further. They're trying to close things down. You see a particular, they tend to overdress, but usually cheaply. They have a very particular aesthetic themselves. They talk in particular ways. It's just not as visible because, first of all, nobody's screaming. But second of all, it's newer. But they have their own aesthetic, their own motifs, their own whole, visual and auditory structure that when you start, it's not, again, not as familiar as what you see on the left, where somebody starts babbling about privilege and you immediately hear this. But you can hear it with the idea that everything's degenerate and that pushing a boundary instead of being queer is now based. They have the same exact program. So they're transgressing the other direction. There are deep reasons for why they're different, but we haven't gone there yet, so I won't push into that. But they're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And the thing at the core is the same, expressing in two ways, according to the kind of underlying value sets that define left versus right, which on the left is radical egalitarianism, anti-traditionalism, and on the right is actually radical hierarchicalism. In fact, they want a rigid, enforced hierarchy in society, which could include racism or not, which could include, privileges for the party members versus not. I mean, that's always the case. And then it also is, I would say it's pseudo-traditional. It harkens to traditions, but the traditions are sort of made up. They're like exaggerations of what people thought the traditions were like 50 years ago or 100 years ago. They have both have their radical historicism about why everything in the founding was either really, really bad or at a high watermark of really, really good. And so, the Germans had the Nazis had their mythology of the grand German history. We have in this woke right thing in the US, we have this mythology of the grand Christian founding of the United States. And ever since we've deviated from it, everything's gone sideways. We had a moral and religious people. They remind us from John Adams saying that that's what's required. We have a moral and religious people. And frankly, that's just a myth. Like people were not more moral. They might have been more religious in some ways, but not always in good ways. But they were certainly not more moral in, say, 1790 than they are now. There was a lot of dirty dealing going on. It's just that a lot of it wasn't as visible, wasn't recorded. And also, 90 something percent of the population was agrarian. So you didn't have this kind of amassed urban life where a lot of that kind of stuff manifests. But if you start looking at, the turn of the 20th century, it's already very clear that people were in many regards far more degenerate than these mythologies suggest.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid observation. I was thinking, the left is often criticized of cultural appropriation, and in a way, what you've described as traditionalist appropriation. This idea that we've lost something, but that is definitely a variable of the right. Now, you've often said that wokeness is a totalizing lens, that everything gets suppressed, reduced to oppressor versus oppressed. You've kind of articulated that. Mm-hmm. What's the psychological or emotional payoff for people who follow that idea?
It's extremely simple. That was the answer. I'm not saying that the answer is simple. I'm saying that it's a very simple paradigm by which to understand the world. So this, whether you want to call it Manichaean splitting or you want to call it splitting in the psychological sense, which is what psychologically disordered people do, to where everybody's either with me or against me, right? So everybody's either a villain or a hero. It's very simple, right? It makes very simple story structures by which you can understand the world. It makes it very cut and dry. There's very little ambiguity. They call these things cognitive and emotional closure. So this kind of a view provides a lot of both cognitive closure and emotional closure. You know who the good guys are. You know who the bad guys are. As soon as you encounter something you don't want to hear, they're a good guy or they're a bad guy. And so they're either an ally or an enemy. So there's an enormous amount of simplicity to the payoff that it provides here. There's also, if you read this, for example, Robert Lifton studied, I don't know if you've heard of Robert J. Lifton, but Robert J. Lifton was a psychologist or psychiatrist. We'll go with psychologist, though, who happened to be in Hong Kong in the early 1950s. So in the 1950s, Mao Zedong had just taken power in China. He took power in 1949, in October of 1949. And so through the 1950s, the beginnings of the purge began. And so what was happening, China hadn't basically put up the walls yet and to keep people in to their socialist country. So what would happen is that people were getting put through ideological remolding, as Mao called it, or thought reform as Lifton translated it. And then they would get exiled. So you'd go through 2 or 3 years of prison where they try to brainwash you into being a communist. And if it didn't work, they'd throw you out of the country. And what they do is pack you up on a boat one way and with no belongings and send you off to Hong Kong to go figure out your life. And so as it turns out, Lifton's in Hong Kong doing some work, starts encountering these people as they've been ejected from China and starts interviewing them and sees that this is very interesting, gets a grant to be able to stay an extra 18 months in Hong Kong. And for a year and a half, he follows, a couple dozen of these people, some Western and some Chinese, who had been ejected from and it's very different in each of the contexts, but had been put through these processes and ejected. So he was looking at the psychology of the totalitarian environment in China under Mao. And it's called thought reform and the psychology of totalism. So this idea of it being totalizing is kind of at the center of it. He called the ideology, or the form of ideology, totalizing, which means it must touch every aspect of life. And so he's going through this and he's talking about, what it kind of brings to people at one point. And he's talking about these two cults. He says it creates two cults. The environment creates two cults that people enact. One, he says, is the cult of confession, and the other is the cult of enthusiasm, as he describes them. I think there's a third cult that's involved that I call the cult of transgression. It's fun to transgress, especially when you feel like you're put under oppression. Nobody's transgressing against Mao, though. What they transgressed against was old culture. Smash the four olds, for example. But that was in the Cultural Revolution later. When in the 50s, when Lifton was looking at this, he said that what you do is you create this situation where everybody knows they're guilty of all kinds of thought crimes. Everybody knows that they're not perfectly anti-racist, to put it in the modern context, perfectly queer or whatever, right? Nobody's a perfect ally. But what they get to do is accuse everybody else of it all the time. And so they get to confess through projection. So they get to alleviate their own sense of guilt while creating this weird camaraderie with other people who are effectively just bullying others, right? So you get this whole like baptism of superiority, right? That you're in the superior category as long as you can keep the blame on other people. And you have other people who affirm that you're in the superior category. And then this leads to a cult of enthusiasm where what would happen is the people that were kind of caught up in this would then be fed the so-called party line. We're going to build a reservoir. We're going to build a canal. We're going to, irrigate all the fields. We're going to get rid of all of the money launderers or whatever target they had at the time. And so everybody gets all enthusiastic because they're promised everything will be better on the other side of the campaign. So there's some campaign. We're going to, spend 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We're going to eradicate racial injustice, whatever it is. And there's this enthusiasm that if we work hard for a few years, we can actually get past this huge problem that society has, and everything is going to be better. That the promise is always that a much brighter future is right around the corner. And the way that we get there is through this mass collective action. And the way that we get mass collective action is to make sure everybody's on the same page. And that's something everybody has a part in. So it doesn't matter how big or small you are, you get to help. And the way that you do that is by, again, the cult of confession activity. So there's tons of psychological and sociological benefits to this. Turns out they're all toxic, but at the point of sale of the individual, they, release massive amounts probably of dopamine or whatever other catecholamines make you feel good, and it works. So that is what you get. You get to be on the so-called right side of history. You get to be on the winning team. You're helping the entire society progress to its next stage. Whereas those interlopers who won't get their vaccines are holding everybody back. So they're the enemy. So now you're superior to them, and you can see how the whole cycle works. So I think that that's part of what they get out of it. They get to feel like good people for being bad people. You don't have to go do or succeed or earn or build or help. All you have to do is browbeat and bully and project your own guilt. And somehow you're producing, you get to blame other people for not doing things as well as they should be. And somehow you're the virtuous one. And so I believe it's this massive perversion that takes advantage of human social psychology in an incredible way. But the benefits psychologically and socially are huge at the point of sale. They just turn out to be really bad in the long run.
Quick break to tell you about the Thinking Society, our flagship course to help you reclaim your mind in a world of noise. Over the course of 6 weeks, you'll dive into the psychology of propaganda, cognitive bias, and the war on truth, and how to become radically better at thinking and seeing clearly in a world gone mad. If you're tired of being told what to think and ready to think deeply, independently, and courageously, this course is for you. Go to weareelevate.org/Thinking Society or click the link in the description to join us now. Now back to the episode.
Yeah, well, this is where it gets fascinating, James, because as you're explaining those three different cults and parts of it in your summary, I can see both of those playing out, these things playing out in the left and the right. So,
yeah,
so this is where it gets really interesting. So let's talk more explicitly about the woke right then, because in my head, I'm almost now starting to view this through the lens of the political compass, which is, you have the left and the right on one axis, and then you might have authoritarian and libertarian on the next. And you can have degrees of left-wing authoritarianism, degrees of right-wing authoritarianism, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And it feels like there is an axis here where you've got the left and right. And the way you described it earlier, the manifestation of the wokeness, in the same way that the manifestation of authoritarianism is different on the left and the right. They have the same fundamental traits, but they almost have different vernacular, different structures. But they're ultimately, if you boil it down to its core, it's authoritarian. In many ways, I'm starting to see that parallel here, where, again, different vernacular, different ways of explaining, whether it's degeneration or a different way of describing the problem. So you've got a kind of left and right wing manifestation of the idea of wokeness. And I think this conversation has helped us distill down, more importantly, to what wokeness really means and remove some of those mimetic parts that make it difficult for people to understand that wokeism itself is a set of characteristics, belief systems, modes of thinking. But when you talk about the woke right, you're describing it as a new phenomenon, or is it new? I'm not convinced it is new. Now, actually,
It's not new.
Based on everything we've talked, I started thinking this is new, but actually, no. This discussion has made it very clear it's not. But what exactly do you mean when you say the woke right in the context of this discussion?
Okay, so I'll say one other thing about woke in general, and I think that'll give us the launch point to do that. And I won't go off in the long tangent about the left again. So woke is a way, I think what we can say in a very simple language is that woke is a way of viewing the world, of literally a worldview. And which is that polar construction of the marginalized and the privileged and the conflict between them. So it's a worldview, and it's a way of behaving in the world because you believe in that worldview, which is that you're the outsider who's now going to transgress against the established order in order to try to liberate your people. For the left and the right, they disagree about who your people are, but that's immaterial in general. There is a your people, and you're going to liberate them. So it's a way of viewing the world and acting in the world. And so the simplest way to put what the woke right is it's people who claim right-wing values, right-wing goals, right-wing identity, who act like woke left. They act the same way. So they are acting in the world accordingly. They use the cancel culture, the bullying, the smearing, the collectivism, the victimhood orientation, the conspiracy theory, the critique. They act the same way as what we've come to see is the woke left. They don't dress the same way. They don't dye their hair purple. They grow a beard. They do very specific. They have a very specific aesthetic of their own. So, but they act like what we're now familiar with as leftists. This also includes, I think, very important to bring up is the transgression, right? We all see the transgression from queer theory constantly. The leftist idea of queer theory is, we're going to have greater amounts. It's not just a pride parade. Now it's going to be, they're going to be fetish performers. Now there's going to be drag queens. Now there's going to be this and that. We're going to put them in the schools. We're going to put them in the libraries, so on and so forth. Transgress. Oh, well, what about animals? Let's talk about animals now, right? The zoo people. And let's, it gets as dark and as gross and children and whatever, however far you want it to go, it's there, right? And it's transgress. Well, what if you transgress the other way? Well, you're going to be a little bit, less racially sensitive. Then you're going to be a little racist. And then you're going to be a lot racist. Maybe you're going to bring up this idea on either side that the Jews are actually the problem, right? So you're going to transgress. Like it's been this norm for a very long time that, maybe blaming the Jews for everything leads to bad places. Maybe that's a really bad sign of where your society is likely to go. So maybe we should, not do that, right? No, we're going to transgress. We're going to jump right into the anti-Semitism on, especially in this case, woke right. We're going to suggest that maybe the Jews really do control everything. We're going to take up recycled tropes from whether it's Nazi Germany or whether it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a Russian Tsarist piece of propaganda that heavily influenced Hitler. We're going to recycle all of these long-standing tropes and bring them all back to the front and make that the center of the conversation. That's a transgression. And what are you doing? You're transgressing not against the other side. You're not saying, what you are saying, let me be more clear. You're saying, the left is oppressing me, so I have to say based things to get out from that. I have to challenge it. So they say, don't be racist, so I'm going to say racial things. But they're not saying just racial things. They're saying racist things when there's a difference, right? And so they lean into that transgression, and the transgression is no longer a rebellion against the overreaches of the left. It becomes a rebellion against the mainstream society. And what you'll notice actually, and this is kind of the hallmark of the woke on both sides, is that it is the mainstream society that is the problem. So on the woke left, whether we're reading from Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, explaining why it is that, we need this liberating tolerance and we need to rethink tolerance completely, to extend tolerance to movements from the left and withdraw it from movements from the right, including censorship and pre-censorship. Herbert Marcuse argues for this explicitly. The reason he gives is because mainstream society is already fascist. So it's We're going to attack mainstream society in the name of the far right, right? So the target is mainstream society because the belief is that, or Marx, mainstream bourgeois society is the thing that enables the exploitative conspiracy to continue. Well, what you see on the far right is that it's classical liberalism has created the conditions by which wokeness can have come into being. As a matter of fact, it's not just that, but you'll read this, whether it's Patrick Deneen, Yoram Hazony, a little bit less with Yoram, Rusty Reno, etc. It is that it is not cultural Marxism or critical theory or any of these things that led to wokeness. It is just the fulfillment of liberalism going where it was supposed to be. So the attack is actually against the mainstream status quo society in the name of the enemy on the other side. And that's a complicated thing to understand. That's the nature of an intelligence attack, by the way. This, you attack one enemy and make them think that you're attacking somebody else or that somebody else attacked them. And so this is it's a sophisticated thing. Like, I want you to think of three camps: left, right, and mainstream. I'm not saying center because it has all kinds of positions in the mainstream. The attack is always done from the left. They attack the mainstream in the name of the right. Right? So Mao purged normal people, lots of them. Often 1 in 1,000 were killed, 2 in 1,000 were sent to prison camps in any given purge. And he did so in the name of eliminating right-wingers. That was always the case, or eliminating a certain kind of criminal. It was always the case. So you attack the mainstream, not the middle, the mainstream, in the name of attacking the far other side. And the woke right does the same thing. It's not Marxism, even though it's very obviously Marxism. You know, I spent 2 years, Dan, going around the world telling people that critical race theory is a form of critical theory, when really all you have to do is put your finger over the word in the middle and you can see it for yourself. Critical race theory. Critical theory with race in between. I spent 2 years trying to explain this to people. But what you do then on the other side is you say it's nothing to do with Marx at all, or Marxism or critical theory or cultural Marxism. It's nothing to do with that. It's just the fulfillment of classical liberalism in free societies. It's the fulfillment of tolerance. So what we have to do now is attack tolerance. We have to attack individual liberty. We have to attack free market economic systems, because they've given rise to all of this. Look how all the corporations participate in woke stuff, and they've all got their rainbow flag on their ad or whatever. Well, that's because nobody's controlling the corporations with a kind of a right-wing fist, which is called a stakeholder model, which was first instantiated in law in 1937 in Nazi Germany, called the Nazi Shareholder Act. If you want to look that up, it's true. So you got to control the mainstream in the name of the failure from the other side. That is a hard thing to understand, but it's the signature of woke behavior. And then it's like I already said, in different ways, which we still haven't talked about specifically, but in different ways, they both have the worldview that there is a controlling powered elite that marginalizes people like them, who are the rightful inheritors to something to do with society, who are therefore in an intrinsic conflict for it.
Absolutely. I mean, that to me is the key commonality between the idea of the woke left and woke right. Now, where things may get complicated is if people dispute your idea of what wokeism really means, and therefore that definition falls apart, and therefore they can no longer see those parallels. But if we adopt that as the definition, I can totally see that on the left and the right. And similarly, if you replace the word bourgeoisie with elite, the sentence sounds like it's come from the right who are attacking the left right now. It's the same idea. And this is where, again, even the language, woke, whether you're using woke or awake, the right tend to use the term awake. We've been using it to describe people who are awake to what's going on during COVID, the jabs, and the broader greater reset. So and again, it has and Mateus even talks about it as a countermass. It has cult-like properties in the same way that the mainstream society has. And again, we're attacking the mainstream. We're attacking the establishment. So the left see the systems of oppression, whereas the right see the deep state. Again, different vernacular, different language to really describe virtually the same thing. And that in either case, they've woken up to something. They've become awakened to something that others are blind to.
Well, so did the Germans. I mean, one of the slogans was Deutschland erwacht, which meant Germany awake. And so, or Germany awaken, I'm not sure which part of speech that is. Deutschland erwacht. So anyway, that same exact theme. Now, one of the tricky parts here is that the left is more wrong about the system that they're attacking than the right is. There is more of a like WHO is real, right? And it really is trying to control everybody, and it's kind of succeeding. And the World Economic Forum is real, and it's really implementing these things. And the kind of global left, to use a term for it, is real, and it's really implementing these things. Whereas the systems of white supremacy, for example, or normalcy or cis heteronormativity or whatever that the left describes, are fairly obvious, lunatic exaggerations of minor dynamics that occur to a degree that most people don't actually support. I mean, one of the better examples of that phenomenon is this concept feminists have of rape culture, that they believe that there's this pervasive pro-rape, that rape continues to occur at the rates that it does because there's pervasive culture within men that thinks it's kind of okay or funny, which actually that's only true of about 3% of men, who tend to be the repeat offenders who could commit most of the rapes, whereas the vast majority of at least Western men are horrified by it. It's not funny. They're not into it. They don't like, if they found out a guy sexually assaulted a woman and they could get away with it with the law, they would go take care of the problem themselves, probably through physical violence. Like, we don't appreciate it, right? So there's this kind of weird, like, fantastic, hysteric view of the systems of power coming from the left, whereas the right is touching reality more closely. But what that means isn't that they're correct. What it means is that greater discernment is needed between where there really are systems implemented to our detriment and where you're just, flinging wildly and blaming things that are the wrong diagnosis to the problem, and thus giving wrong solutions.
I think, again, when we come back to Marxism on that, and again, Marxism is a broad term that incorporates many different scholars and academics and writers on the topic. But if you take it to one of its primary manifestations of the idea of a centralized, centrally planned and centrally managed society, well, the left aren't going to complain about the WHO having such authority, or the WEF or the United Nations. In their view, that's within their favor. That's the ideal world that you described earlier, that they are rallying and fighting for. So by default, the right, who are typically more libertarian in their viewpoint, in this case, again, separating them on the compass. But if you take the more libertarian view on that, then the idea of any central institution having such power and control is abhorrent. So it's two completely different worldviews on the same thing, which is...
Well, they operate on different scales, right? So the left also operates on a universalist scale. They see all of humanity as equally alienated from their rightful inheritance as, socialists, basically, of one stripe or another. And on the right, they don't think of that way. They don't think universally. They think on a different scale. So the scale they think of is on some kind of a family. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a literal family. The national family is usually the scale they end up thinking on. It could be the religious family. It could be a cultural family, like regionalist kind of thing. But they tend to think in terms of a cohesive people rather than all people. And so this cohesive people, in their opinion, will have these not libertarian at all, extraordinarily coercive, centrally planned circumstances, but it will be theirs and for them only. So you might have one in America and a different one in Canada and a different one in Britain and a different one in France and a different one everywhere else that you want, Italy, Germany, whatever, China, whatever, and Israel. Everybody can have their own, but they're all going to be of that sort within themselves. And so this is a very confusing point for a lot of people, because this is one of these intrinsic differences between woke left and woke right, is that woke left thinks in terms of these kind of universal sweeping things where everybody is alienated by the power dynamic universally. It's a universal problem. Racism is universal in every country, everywhere, always. Whereas the right doesn't care about that. And in fact, it's inimical to that. And the right manifestation is that there is a rightful people who deserve the inheritance of their nations. And so the nation is going to be arranged in a rigid, hierarchical, therefore authoritarian form to make sure that those people are properly rewarded and all the interlopers are not. So on the left, they punish people specifically who are not getting along with the program. On the right, they punish people who are not getting along with the program to uphold the specific nation and its rightful inheritors. So it's different in the sense that the scale upon which, the maximum scale upon which it's meant to be implemented is universal versus national. And the logic there is different. It's also the mechanism of alienation is different. On the left, we're alienated from the introduction or imposition of all of these injustices, racism, private property, individualism, and so on. On the right, though, the alienation is due down to tolerance. We had a good thing going. It was very oppressive and it worked. It was very hierarchical, in other words, and it worked. And now it's not working because we were too tolerant of those dirty whoever they are that we let in, and their stupid bad ideas or their degeneracy or whatever else that has torn apart the magical fabric that made us all willing to share with one another and still be socialist in both cases.
Yeah. Well, I can see the patterns. You use the term universalist, which I think is an extension of kind of the globalist idea. And, on the right, obviously known more for nationalism and, the different frameworks that come with different parameters. And yeah, very interesting. Okay. So what I want to do is really drill down into the similarities and differences. So what are the structural, or what are the different factors, whether we're looking at structurally or worldview, belief systems, that are held in common between what you're describing as the woke left and right?
It's always that there's an illegitimate elite that's in charge of everything who's alienating the people from their rightful inheritance. That's always the circumstance. So that's a commonality. And that's, in fact, the defining commonality. That's the thing you wake up to become woke, in my use of the word woke, which, by the way, is not arbitrary. People accuse me of making up this definition of woke. The problem is I had this word, which admittedly was slang, to describe this thing, and then I read thousands, probably tens of thousands of articles within that broad set of literature, and they all say the same thing about what they think. And so the same thing that they all say about what they think is the thing that I decided must be what they mean. So that's the definition I've attached to woke. But what I just said, that there's this intrinsically conflict-oriented power structure where the privileged people alienate the marginalized from their true inheritance, is a commonality. That's always a commonality. The behaviors that result from this are also a commonality. There's an elitism to the people who get it, the people who are now woke, who understand that society operates this way. They either are on the right side of history, they know what time it is, they know what's going on, they're hip, they're woke, whatever the words are, and that they are fighting for the correct social structure that will provide the common good, which they understand and other people don't. Therefore, they are intrinsically elite, and they are intrinsically given some right to rule as elites. And so this is always the case. Now, the Marxists at least have a nice lie about this to cover their own butts, which is that they are trying to get rid of the state in the long run. The planned central state is only a stepping stone to the final stateless, classless utopia. So they're pretending that they're not going to rule forever, but they're obviously going to rule forever because that's never going to work. So there's the third thing. See if I can remember how I was going to phrase it. I thought of it in the middle of that, as sometimes goes. Is that with their right to rule, they also have the intrinsic right to punish people who don't get along with the program. And the idea ultimately is that it can only work if you have everybody on board, and you have to get rid of the people who have different opinions. So they have very low tolerance for freedom. They have very low tolerance for variation of thought. And so this intrinsic right to rule that they believe in of themselves, because they are more awake to everything than everybody else, becomes an intrinsic right to punish. This is encoded directly in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Lenin explicitly said that its primary purpose is to punish dissenters. It's Mao's totalitarian government. He said its primary purpose was to punish dissenters. This is what the Nazis did as well, although with somewhat less of a heavy hand. But this right to punish. And then the final, I think, big commonality, other than the kind of things we already talked about with, specific behaviors, cancel culture, struggle sessions, and humiliation rituals of their enemies and so on. Well, I guess maybe there's two. One is that they always orient it toward the folk or the people. So they claim that what their right to rule is in representation of the common good, which is for all of the people. So it's a stakeholder model. Everybody's a stakeholder in the whole society. The people who qualify as being part of the society, in other words, that are on board with the party line, are to be benefited. Everybody else is an enemy of the state. and therefore they're doing it in the name of the people. So the Nazis were doing it in the name of the folk. It wasn't the Nazis wanting to be Nazis, it was the Nazis wanting to help the German folk. And Mao literally said that there are the people and the enemies of the people, and right, so the people who get along with socialism, he defined explicitly, are the people, and everybody who doesn't go along with socialism is the enemies of the people. And this is the same in Soviet Union, everywhere else. So they have this, we're doing it in the name of the folk, right? So the critical race theory is always in the name of the poor racial minorities, even though they're obviously like just destroying those people's lives. It's always in the name of. And so finally, then I guess the other piece of that is the friend enemy distinction always arises. That's as it was named by Carl Schmitt, but this phenomenon precedes Carl Schmitt. It appears anywhere this totalitarian mindset arises, the woke mindset. It's the Manichaean splitting that I mentioned earlier, which is that there are people that are with you or your friends, and everybody else is your enemy. Your enemies are indicative of a destruction of your intended way of life, and therefore have to be completely smashed, marginalized, and destroyed if they can't be converted. And so you have this, this is kind of the essence, not just of authoritarianism, but totalitarianism. And these are all the commonalities that exist on both sides of this.
I was just saying, I'm like my head in my hands almost. Like I'm like, oh my God, because everything you're saying, like the COVID resistance has demonstrated a lot of what you've talked about. I've been part of it. I'm looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, fuck me, excuse my language, I'm woke as fuck here. I should have dyed my hair blue again, because like we the people, you know, it's one of those things. We're doing it for the people. We are the protesters. We are the 99%. You know, it's like it's.
This is why I'm telling you, it's more difficult when there's actually like the COVID situation. I'm with you. Like I came to Geneva and stood on that stage and yelled alongside all of you guys. Yeah, I went after it, man. I called them Babel and said God won't be mocked. I mean, I went for it full blast, and it's true. The fact is that this is why more discernment. It's a harder bar. The left had its appeal to empathy, which people started, which has a shelf life. The right, however, has the appeal to the fact that there really is a attempted global takeover right now, which the left is doing. The global left. And this right, therefore, has much firmer ground to stand on. So you have to, when you look yourself in the mirror, as you said, you have to ask yourself, like, do you really see this as a splitting of us versus them, friend versus enemy, and everybody who's not fully on board is a problem? Probably you don't. Maybe you're more extreme than I know. You know, do you have those specific characteristics? Saying that it's in the name of trying to help people get out from underneath the thumb of another way to phrase this is that there's literal oppression. It really exists. South Africa is literally oppressing its citizens. The World Health Organization is literally oppressing everybody under its circumstance. Real oppression exists. So it's not believing that there is oppression and that oppression needs to be fought that makes you woke. What makes you woke is believing that that is fundamentally the organizing principle of society, and you're in this transcendent cosmic battle. And the only way to be able to think of yourself, in fact, is class identity. That's why the identity politics always comes up. It's always down to class identity. Marx phrased it this way: the supersession of the self through the retraction of one's alienation into yourself. Okay, so the idea is that you are no longer going to see yourself as, you know, Dan Astin-Gregory who's fighting the good fight. You're going to see yourself as an intrinsic part of the class against the other class, right? That's a different mindset. Those are two different things entirely. And that's the dividing line between woke and not woke. Like, I've never seen you do a struggle session on anybody. I don't follow you that closely, but I've never seen you just go off on somebody who, you know, maybe a doctor or one of these other volunteers or somebody else who gets involved who has a slightly different opinion to yours. Like, no, you're probably not woke. Like, go to bed easy tonight.
Keep my red naturally going. My slightly graying hair thanks to all this protesting.
Well, that speeds up, don't.
Yeah, I mean, the last 5 years has aged me hard. I'm trying to
me too.
Trying to reverse that right now, as my audience know. But yeah, so I want to extrapolate some of these things then, because identity politics on the left, you know, how is that different then from, say, nationalist identity politics? These are all I'm just going to riff for a few here. Cancel culture, how is that different from that? The purity tests on the right that we see, the victimhood narrative on the left. It sounds exactly the same when you think about it, as we are under attack by the globalists. You know, same language really. If you might
They
fight.
are exactly the same.
Yeah, moral policing, has many different patterns to the kind of like patriotism. That's not a critique on patriotism, but it's saying that there's a morality element to it. Language policing on both sides, institutional capture both sides. So this is where I think there's an abundance of censorship on both sides. There's an abundance of commonalities.
Yeah, so the differences are like, with identity politics, the question is, who are the nations, right? So obviously you could conceive of the entire critical race theory thing as having set up the nation of people of color, right? Or you could imagine, in fact, one of the leading publications for queer theory in the popular press in the United States is called LGBTQ Nation, right? So there is that same sense. This actually dips back to something that Stalin wrote in 1913 called Marxism and the National Question. So all the different identity enclaves actually think of themselves kind of like ethnic enclaves. They have their own values, their own traditions, their own so on and so forth. But this bleeds over very naturally on the other side, on the right. They mean the literal nation, as it's organized as a people, which can mean ethnically, culturally, or politically, or some combination thereof. So it could be people with a shared religion, people with a shared language, people with shared geography. There's a lot of different ways they could organize it. And, Hitler had a little bit of all of them. Franco was very much looking for a religious and political identity. Mussolini was a little bit religious with his identity, but he was very strong in the nationalist, like political. Italy is a political force, and we're going to, bind together under the fascist mentality. So it's a little bit different in all of those cases, but it's much more literal. Whereas the identity politics on the left is that the identities are actual identities, because the identities are the dividing lines in society where they have that intrinsic conflict. White supremacy is a dynamic that's imposed by white people on people of color who don't want it, so they have to bind together as a single national entity to fight back against it. So that gives color to how the differences appear. The policing and so on is a little bit, it's all generally the same, but there's some small differences. The left, I've said, tries to undermine its enemies intellectually, morally, and psychologically. So they come after you and they say, you don't understand the theory adequately, so you're too stupid to criticize this. You don't know critical race theory. You don't even know what it is. You can't even define it. It's just a legal theory, blah, blah, blah. So they intellectually undercut you, or they morally undercut you. You're a racist. Therefore, you're not really, we don't need to hear your story. Or they do it psychologically. You're crazy. This isn't really happening. And that's all your gaslighting. The right does it a little bit differently. They're not as interested in cutting you down intellectually that you don't understand. They do somewhat. Like I just saw a tweet this morning somebody sent me that said that the UK is lowering its voting age to 16. And obviously this benefits the left. And the reason it benefits the left is because young people skew left and are obviously also very inundated with leftist thinking in their media and in their school. But the guy who I identify as a woke right character said that the reason was that more people voting always benefits the left because most people are stupid and don't know how to vote right. But that's not what it is. It's not more people. It's young people in particular. There's something different here. But anyway, they kind of care about that, but they're very invested that you don't have the moral standing. You're too degenerate or whatever to have an opinion. You have porn brain or whatever it is that they accuse you of, or that you're not physically fit enough. So therefore you're a slob in your lifestyle. Therefore you don't have, standing to be able to make commentary. You're not even taking your own physical, being seriously. So you're not taking your ideas seriously. They also have they definitely try to psychologically undermine people. They call everybody they disagree with schizophrenic. They say it's a schizophrenic take. I don't know why they've all decided on schizophrenia, but that's the one they use, probably projection, if I had to guess. And there's kind of a religious and cultural element to the purity thing too that's much stronger than on the left. So you're not sufficiently, as you mentioned, it's not that patriotism is bad, but you're not sufficiently patriotic or patriotic in the right way. You don't really care about the country. You have dual loyalty. You're a sellout. You're a shill. You're working for a foreign government, whatever it happens to be. So they undercut you in slightly different ways, but those slightly different ways are based off of their value orientations, which again were universalist versus particular. And the particular is always in the view of the nation. And they're very, very, very concerned with your moral standing, your moral right to speak. So it's slightly different. But otherwise, I mean, like you said, the comparisons are just the same. The more interesting things to draw apart are, why aren't normal people who are engaged in this fight, why are they not woke? Rather than, I mean, everything else is so the same shaming techniques, same public shaming campaigns, same trying to reach out to people and say, you know, you want to get away from this person because he's morally polluted in something terrible. Well, you know, you'll be guilty by association if you don't get away. That's the cancel culture dynamic. All of the other stuff is the same. It's just the identity groups are different, obviously. People of color, you know, homosexual, what else? People of color, homosexual, you know, Muslim, probably not Christian at any rate, is what I'm looking for, you know, counter hegemonic to historically Western cultural hegemony. And then on the other side, it's no, we're going to lean into traditional Western cultural hegemony. So you're going to be straight white male Christian is favored, whereas that's demonized on the other side. And so, you know, you get the picture. I say that same energy, opposite direction where that's happening. They have their own intersectionality, but you know, the more boxes you tick off in intersectionality, the more oppression points you have. So you're like, I'm a disabled, you know, trans, lesbian, person of color or whatever. You have lots of them, and a Muslim. So you're not, you know, Christian. So you have tons of intersectional points. But on the right, it's that I'm a straight white male Christian and patriot. So now you've tick, 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 tick. You know, you've got all the boxes. They've got their own intersectionality on both sides. It works the same way. It's just different groups, so it's not quite as visible.
Yeah, when it's even down topically, you know, when the amount of people that the freedom movement is broken down because you're into terrain theory or virus theory, it's like tick, tick. It's like tick, tick, tick. You have to fit the box. If you don't, you're out. Like literally, I'm not won't follow you anymore because you've got this. I agree with you on these things, but that over there, no, you're gone, mate. You know, it's that's the problem. James, we're just going to take a quick ad break. Okay, James. So we talked about the mimetic kind of characterization of the woke left. If you were to help people understand this in the kind of oversimplified, overgeneralized way that a kind of mimetic take creates, how would you describe, if someone was browsing social media or watching YouTube, what would be the telltale signs that they're observing someone on the woke right?
There are a number. It depends on kind of which camp they're in. I mean, certainly there are some giveaways. The so-called noticers are quite literally woke. The noticers are noticing that the Jews or Israel are behind everything somehow in mysterious and nefarious ways. So they literally have adopted the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that the Jews control everything. That is the motif for all of the woke conspiracy theories, whether it's the white people control everything, or the straight people control everything, or the normal people control everything, or the able-bodied people control everything. It's the same model. So some of them are very literal. So if you see the people kind of suggesting with the we're just asking questions, we're just noticing things, it's always, you know, the same people. You know, I saw, for example, Nick Fuentes. Somebody sent me a video of him today. He's quite famously, I would say he's probably an avatar woke right character. And so he starts saying, well, who's defending Jeffrey Epstein? And it turns out none of them are defending Jeffrey Epstein. They're defending President Trump and his take on the issue. But who's defending him? And he says Ben Shapiro and a couple of other people. And he says, what do they all have in common? Well, they're Jews. So he literally says that. And so you can see, like, that's a pretty dead giveaway. But I hate going there first because I think that the anti-Semite stuff is mostly, I think it's mostly disposable. I don't think that will be the characterizing feature forever. What you will see is people who say that, you know, there's no way out of this within the existing system. So remember that Horkheimer said that critical theory is, it's impossible to articulate a better system on the terms of the existing system. So you can't just vote our way out of this. You know, this is going to take a revolution. Maybe we need a civil war or something of that kind. This always escalating rhetoric, but that there's no way out. The kind of black pill, as they call it, attitude is pretty indicative. A phrase that they use a lot, like I said, is knowing what time it is. So that indicates that they know something nobody else knows. They understand that, you know, the situation is as bad as it is. Blaming the long classical liberal tradition for things that are not even within that tradition For example, woke left is openly, in its own words, anti-liberal. It is hostile to liberalism, but they say that the woke identity politics, equity, and so on are all within the liberal tradition. None of them are. So blaming classical liberalism for things that are not classically liberal. Any kind of revolutionary speak, the idea that we don't, that is like that it's the reason that we're in this situation is not because crafty and bad actors, whether they're Marxist, whether they're Fabian, or whatever other groups, have taken over our systems and taken us into a bad place. So therefore we have to get back to where we were without that parasite attached to our system, but rather that it was the system itself. So the long-standing tradition, say, of English liberalism, which is the tradition literally of the entire Anglo-American experiment, if we kind of combine it into one long arc reaching back maybe to Magna Carta or longer, that itself is the problem. So what we need is a completely new system. And in fact, they usually will call it post-liberal. What you'll also find is a good signature is these guys saying that Karl Marx and the critical theorists and the postmodernists had a lot right. Like, no classical liberal or traditional conservative says that. None do. So saying they had a lot right and we can pick up their tools, we can pick up their tactics, we can use a lot of their analysis. I mean, Marx was definitively wrong on virtually everything. And it was shown even before he died. So this is a preposterous statement. Finding alignment, they'll often find alignment with more often historical figures on the left, that they agree with. There's a kind of a small campaign on the far right in the US to, and I quote, reclaim FDR for conservatives. Like one of the most progressive presidents we ever had is now a tyrant, is allegedly, it's time to reclaim him as right wing. And the reason they like him is because he exercised strong executive state power. This expansion of executive power in line with Carl Schmitt's political theories is a more refined note, but I mean, it could go on and on. Another one, though, is also, it's one thing to be Christian, and it's another thing to say you can't have an opinion because you're not. Like, that's very common. Saying that everything is about, very dichotomous views of everything. You're either with us or you hate white people. That's very common, right? So all of those behaviors, they just have the same things, the same BS tricks we heard from the left for the last 10 years. They're just being used now with kind of the opposite direction. But those are all symptoms. The left said we're on the right side of history. You want to be on the right side of history. The right says we know what time it is and we have to win. They talk about winning all the time. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It matters if we win. They'll accuse their opponents who are more, moderate or sensible or just realistic of having no solutions, because the only solutions are radical solutions, which actually the only solutions are give us power and we'll solve the problem for you. We'll tell you how after you give us the power.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think what's happened here is the left haven't yet clocked how mimetic this is, because it's because the kind of libs of TikTok, etc., and everything else associated with that has made a meme around everything. I mean, there is total opportunity to do the same with the right. And as you were speaking, I was also thinking about the extreme caricatures of the kind of QAnon movement, and then the more extreme ends of the MAGA movement, and then they are equally ideological to the point of dogmatism.
Sure.
The idea of being red-pilled, which if you take the political connotations out of that, which is, again, it's been associated with the right, but again, it's the idea of awakening to some unseen truth and power structure. It's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. How do we escape it, James?
Well, I mean, one thing for sure is that people have got to be a lot more cautious about rabbit holes. There's this saying, I think Michael Malice might have said it first, but somebody else may have. I'll give Michael credit, though. I like him. He said that the point with a red pill, if you watch the movie The Matrix, is that you take one of them. You don't take the whole bottle.
You overdose on the red pill.
Right. So, like, you could think of the red pill as some kind of information that opens your eyes to something you didn't know before. Like, oh my God, the World Health Organization is actually a bad organization. right? Well, taking another one is, going to lead you further down some rabbit hole. And the next thing you think, it's like the moon doesn't exist and the earth is flat. And you don't want to go down the rabbit hole all the way. You don't want it to be like, oh, we go back, however many steps and it was definitely all the Jews, or, this was all Hitler had it right. Like, people say all these things because they just keep taking red pills and going a little further down. I think people have got to be how do we fight this? People have got to be a lot more judicious with their media intake. So here's the problem, is that we all know that we got lied to by the media vigorously. This is not a conspiracy theory. CNN, BBC, etc. They lied to us. They lied to us extraordinarily. Every establishment or legacy media outlet, New York Times, you name it, lied to us. All of them. So then people said, well, where am I going to get my news? Well, you find alternative media that you trust. Well, the thing is, we all heard President Trump say, you're the fake news media, to all of this legacy established media. Well, the thing is that alt media can be fake news alt media too, right? And a lot of people have followed a lot of influencers who, for the most part, are amateurs, by the way, who are not doing any, they're not doing journalistic due diligence on a lot of the things that they present. And we've got to be more judicious with our media diet, if that makes any sense. And I think that that's extremely important to get out of this. The other thing, another symptom I would tell people is like, so how do you pick what media you take in? I don't know. That's actually extraordinarily hard. My actual argument at this point is less is more. The less media you consume, it's probably the more likely you are to be better informed. Not down to zero, obviously, because that's like a impossibility. But one very good heuristic that I know of is that anybody who's always turning the temperature up on issues should be avoided. If all they do is ratchet the attention up or the temperature up, like the way that the fake news media did with Trump during his presidency the first time, like the fake news media did with COVID during the first 3 years, 2 years especially, all it was temperature up, temperature up. Oh my God, another variant. We're all going to have to, everything's temperature up, temperature up. Well, anybody who's turning the temperature up all the time is not doing media or journalism. They're doing agitprop, which is the word that means agitation and propaganda, which came from Lenin. And the goal is to have you in an agitated, psychologically addled state where you're highly suggestible into radical beliefs and solutions. So when you notice somebody's approach is to cause more and more and more anxiety and stress with their reporting, it's time to turn that channel off. Find somebody else. They're not serving you well. And then, try to stay alert, because a lot of this is happening through hostile foreign influence campaigns, for example. If you don't think that a significant number of our major influencers are purchased by hostile foreign countries, then you're extremely naive at this point. And that includes, China, it includes Middle Eastern countries. Qatar is very famous for doing this. They dump a lot of money into it. That may include Russia. I'm pretty sure it does. A lot of the bots that pretend to be America First campaigners on America, or on X, I should say. Not even just bots, but just kind of popular anonymous accounts. They claim to be big, American patriots, are Pakistani. And like, these are not people who have the best interests of our countries or our people or ourselves in mind. They have political agendas that don't even match those of our own countries. So, stay aware. And there's this, I hate to say this because it's so trendy. Have you heard of Gelman amnesia? Gelman amnesia is, so like, if you're reading, let's say you're reading the New York Times, right? And there's an article in the New York Times that's something you know an awful lot about. You're an expert in that field, right? Whatever it is. And you read the article and you're like, this is crap. They're wrong about everything, right? The journalism here is terrible. So let's say it's, global health, right? And you read it and you're like, they don't know anything about this. Gelman amnesia is believing that all the other articles are fine. Only the ones that you're an expert in are the ones that you're skeptical of. So all the other ones are probably, well, it's in the New York Times, because you don't have the expertise to know how it's crap, right? And so there's a lot of that going on, which is that, the people on our side are generally good, and therefore, when they get a bunch of stuff wrong, we don't have to worry about that too much. But no, you actually have to worry about that much more than we are. which is why I'm still urging that, less is frequently more. You have to do your own research without going down too many rabbit holes. It's a very delicate situation. I strongly encourage people. It sounds silly. It's been a meme. It's not a meme. It's real. I've been doing it now for a couple of months, and it's been astonishingly helpful. Is to put it all down, and to the degree physically possible, given weather and such, to spend some time, and I mean real time, a couple of hours with all your devices down, ideally outside, doing something normal life stuff. You'll notice that most of the normal people you see at the grocery or whatever that you get frustrated, like they wouldn't be so calm if they knew what was going on. At some point, yes, but you're also the crazy one who knows too much about what's going on. Like the way you bring temperature down is by lowering your temperature too. And I found it extremely helpful. You're much more clear in your thinking. You're much less agitated. I think those are major first steps. The other thing is that we have to be able to articulate what it is we're defending. What do we want out of this? Do we want is the goal to get, say, the WHO to go away? Or is the goal to have free people being able to make good, responsible decisions, right? Because if the goal is just to get rid of the WHO, you can do that with a helicopter and a rocket. But that's maybe not what we're looking for, right? Maybe we're looking for a different, like, what's the goal here, right? And I think the goal is to preserve free societies. It is to create situations for prosperity and abundance for people to live their lives freely and pursue their ambitions and dreams with a minimal of interference. And so if you lose sight of what we're actually fighting for, which in this case is the long tradition of Anglo-American liberalism, then and freedom and probably free enterprise as part of that. If you lose sight of that and you decide you're going to win at all costs, then you've lost your marbles. Like, because there's such a thing as a Pyrrhic victory, where you win the battle, but you ultimately lose the war, or you lose the thing that you were fighting to preserve in the process. So I think it's very important for us to try to keep our heads about that. So that means knowing what it is we're defending. So it's a great time always to go back and reread that long history that we all should have got in school. And maybe we did, and maybe we didn't, and we've forgotten, or we were whatever. We should go back and, reread that tradition that we're embedded in, that we want to have succeed. Because if people can't articulate it, especially against these nuanced attacks, then we're not going to be able to defend it. And then finally, you do have to draw lines. You have to be able to say, like, this is what we want, but that's not what we want. And we're not so desperate here that we're going to be radical in return. We believe in the systems that we have to be able to fight back against these problems. And then I think that is going to be probably pretty key. We're also going to have to, attempt to work together to the degree that we can. Those are some suggestions I have based on basically my experience in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, man, you look vibrant, man, taking that low information diet and getting out there into the fresh air. So I've been trying to do that myself. And
sunshine helps. I know that you don't have any on your island, but
right now we do it. So we're in a rich period of abundant sunshine, which is.
No, I hear you guys have quite a lot of heat, and everybody's also losing their minds.
Yeah, they're turning all the maps scorched earth right behind you now.
I'm just back from New Zealand earlier this week, and it's winter there, so I'm excited to be back to the sun.
Yes. So I have one more question for you on this point, because we've touched on it, the cult-like manifestation of wokeism. It's well known for those who've critiqued on the left how that shows up. What's your take now if people start to find themselves in a counter cult? And actually that brings a bigger point, actually, because there's lots written on this idea that the new counterculture is conservatism, or there's a right-wing counterculture which mirrors the counterculture of the 60s on the left. I think there's lots of evidence of that based on what we've discussed today. I think there's a difference between counterculture and cult, but there's elements there can be a fine line when you get to the edges of it. If someone finds themselves, what can people look out for to make sure that they have not just traded one fight for rather they're fighting another cult and becoming part of a cult themselves? How do they first notice that? Because I think noticing it is the first thing.
There are two primary ways that people notice that they're in a cult from my experience and my reading. One is that they notice that what they're being told does not actually align with reality. So they see the gaps, which I think happens sometimes. But I think the other one is, especially in this kind of counter cult, it's harder to see that. What is kind of more glaring for people is the social dynamic. The social dynamic of a cult is extremely, has an extremely strong and distinct signature. And if you are noticing this cult dynamic around yourself, then you're probably not crazy, and you might be in a little bit of danger, or you might already be in pretty deep, and you need to start doing some thinking. And that signature is that there are the people you're allowed to be around and the viewpoints you're allowed to consume, and then there are the ones that you are not, right? And so if you find yourself in a group of friends who's constantly telling you you can't work with them because of some pejorative, or you can't entertain their ideas because of some slander or whatever else, you are probably in a cult-like environment. One other one that people have noticed, I think maybe even it's similar to this. It's part of the social dynamic that a lot of people have noticed that I've talked to who have already noticed that they're in the so-called woke right counter cult and broken free of it, is they started to notice that the pressure to be more extreme in their social circles tends to go up and up and up. And that when they feel that, Jiminy Cricket conscience weighing on them in their heart, and they want to put the brakes on, they either feel strongly pressured not to, or if they try to draw a line and say, this is as far as I'm willing to go, the group turns on them and mocks them. There's a very bullying dynamic for people who won't continue to go along with the transgressive game. And actually, I've heard from probably half a dozen people in the past 3 or 4 months that that's what they noticed, was that there was this constant pressure to escalate the radical views, to take a more and more extreme position, and that if you didn't, then you were, a major problem. I won't use any of the words, but you can imagine what they are. The left uses racist and transphobe and so on. The right uses different words, that almost all of which are not appropriate to say anywhere. All right, whatever. Jew, faggot, cuck, shill, sellout, controlled opposition. Yeah, all of it. The slurs. And like I said, that's these social dynamics stick out to people. And if you're getting shamed for reading something, that, you were curious about by your social circle, this is a signature. These dynamics, it's helpful to read up on the dynamics of either like an abusive relationship, literally, like if I'm dating a narcissist, what do I do? You read a little bit of that, and if that's your social environment, you're probably in a cult. If and this is, I think, probably one of the biggest tests ever, if you know good and damn well that if you decided to go against the group, it's not just that they would be disappointed or unhappy, but they would turn on you viciously. Sir, you're in a cult. If you know your social group will turn on you viciously for disagreeing, you're in a cult, and you've got to start trying to figure out a way to extract yourself from that.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, there's the phrase controlled opposition, and I use the phrase captured opposition, because you're captured by your audience. There's a term called audience capture, where if you don't continue to dance the dance and put on the show they want you to see, then you're ousted. They'll turn on you. They will literally turn on you. The smart people, if they find someone they disagree with, they just politely, just walk on. But the ones who are in that cult-like mentality, they will go hard on you if you have any point of disagreement. I get it in the comments all the time, and it's only on the edges. But like if you have to guard against it, because otherwise you become beholden to it, and you keep dancing the dance that they want you to dance. You're they play the tune and expect you to become the performing monkey, and it's very tricky. And then of course you have the algorithmic factors, which favor outrage and sensationalism, so it's not just social dynamics, it's technological dynamics and all of this creates an environment for the cult to prevail on either side of the domain, and for wokeism to come alive.
Yeah, with that, I actually would add, just as a general hygiene, information hygiene mentality, is be very selective and start trying to figure out how to do this. Even if you have a very small account on social media, be very selective in which comments you read and engage with and which ones you ignore entirely. And certainly don't argue with everybody who disagrees with you. You might literally be arguing with a chat GPT bot from a foreign country. And literally in that case, not just every minute you spend replying, but every minute you spend reading the words is just a waste of time. You're not even engaging with another human being. And so finding a way not to read a lot of the comments, which is challenging. I've spent a lot of time, and I've refined it over time, contouring my notification space so that I don't see a ton of the stuff. And I know I lose some very valid things, and that's a tragedy. I would like to see valid commentary, but I don't want to see constant abuse. I don't want to see foreign disinformation ops. I don't want to talk. I want to spend 0% of my life talking to a bot. I don't need Elon Musk's anime waifu on Grok. I don't want a digital friend or girlfriend or enemy or anything. And so, having comment section hygiene and developing a strategy for comment section hygiene, I think, is going to be extremely important for people to get through these, frankly, broad-scale psychological operations. The technological features have changed the game entirely from even 5 years ago.
Yeah, there's a spiritual teacher called Ramdas who he said he used to meditate deeply for 30 minutes before reading the news, just to avoid getting emotionally reactive to the news, and so you could just see it as words on the page. And I think I almost need to do that before reading the comments, just to harness myself. But interestingly, on the comments, you mentioned ChatGPT. What if there's been a number of times, and this is I've actually got an entire chat thread on this, which is just for me to say, what I normally write is, how on earth does this person see the world this way? And then I copy their comment into ChatGPT, and it'll extract, because, I can tell you use it as well, but the more you use it, the more it understands your worldview. And so it says, well, I can see why you feel differently about this. And I find it very interesting to start to see how someone might come to a way of thinking, even if it's diametrically opposed to mine. And then I don't necessarily even respond, because you're absolutely right. All it does is but it gives me greater understanding of how certain people see the things so differently. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It's the ancient art of empathy. It's like, right, okay, I understand how you got to that. I think it's completely wild and flawed, but I see how you got there. And it's actually, in many ways, it's starting to enrich my understanding of things rather than simply be an emotional trigger. Talking of comments, I want to wrap up. We recently interviewed your colleague and co-author Helen Pluckrose, one of our most popular episodes yet, which led to us reaching out to you to really have a continuation of the conversation. There was some really interesting both pushback and challenge in the comments. There's the usual trolling, which I did actually use ChatGPT to analyze some of it. But there's two comments I'd like to put to you for your response, and then we'll come to the end. So you've probably seen like this before, but one of the comments said, the right can't be woke. They're just pushing back on the madness. How do you respond to that?
I call those people sweet summer children. You're just pushing back, and you could never possibly do it wrong or never possibly get caught up in a dualistic, Gnostic way of thinking about it. No, that's just arrogance at the best. Just insane naivety maybe is at the best, arrogance at the worst. The right certainly can be infected by this idea of a conspiracy theory against them. And I don't mean that there's actually an oppressive structure against them that's different than a conspiracy theory against them. A broad social conspiracy that requires the marginalized to band together to fight back. It turns out that I wish that were the case. I wish it were the case that there were people broadly, as say even defined by their political orientation, who are immune to sociological Gnostic distortions, but that's not true. I'm not going to go as extreme as Jordan Peterson did, but it is an element to this, and he's not entirely wrong, and I did sit down and discuss it with him, as people saw. But Jordan Peterson said it this way, is that there are psychopaths and cluster B personality disorders and dark tetrad disorders on both sides, on every side, anywhere. And that, there are grifters who will attach themselves to these parasitic structures and so on. And frankly, there are also disinformation operatives who want you to draw wrong conclusions. If it makes you feel better in your heart that the genuine right, whatever that technically means, can't be woke, it is entirely possible that the genuine right could have left-wing agents provocateur leading them into positions that do the left's work for them. And many people have fallen into those positions who are genuinely good conservative people. I would agree that conservatives cannot be woke, but the right wing is not the same as conservatives, as the woke right make very clear. You can definitely fall off the cliff in the right wing, but being conservative by definition means that you are very cautious about any kinds of extremes or any types of radical changes. I mean, if you go back and read Edmund Burke, it by definition refers to that. So it's very difficult for a conservative to be woke, but you can cease to be conservative and become radically right-wing. The alt-right is just the old term for woke right, by the way. And what makes them alt or alternative is that they're woke about how society operates, but for their own goals and ambitions.
Oh, that's a clippable moment. One final one. Woke right is a lazy term, they say. These people aren't enforcing new morality. They're resisting cultural collapse.
I mean, it's pretty clear they're enforcing a new morality. I don't know what planet these people are on. I guess they're inside the morality, so it's like being a fish inside the water and not knowing what water is. It's very easy to tell they're enforcing a new morality if you disagree with it. Like, let's say, as happened to me, that in the context of a First Amendment argument that I was making years ago, back in 2019 or something like that, you were to say something awkward like amateur porn is freedom, but you were making this subsidiary, as in like a thread in replies on Twitter to somebody talking about porn in whatever regard or another. And then you were to say, like it or not, the First Amendment defends pornography as a form of expression. Right. So this is American First Amendment law. And then you go on, somebody says something about it and you say, go on and say amateur porn is freedom. Well, there's a new morality out there that has taken a screenshot of that tweet out of context of the story and spread it around to make sure that I'm not allowed to speak to Christian groups because I defend amateur porn, because we're going to have an absolutely no porn morality. It's a very Puritan morality and a very kind of falsely Puritan morality, as a matter of fact. So it certainly is defending a new morality. And that's just one example. How many freaking examples would you like? I mean, there's so many. So that's not correct. They are pushing back against cultural collapse, but I heard a magic word in that comment, and maybe you added it, maybe you read it exactly, or maybe I've invented it, but that word is just. Is the word just in that sentence? They're just pushing back against cultural collapse.
No,
that's not there.
That was in the first one. The first one was the right kind of work. They're just pushing back on the madness. So the just was in the first one, not the...
Yeah, so just is a signature word for these things. They're not just pushing back on the cultural madness. They are trying to assert a cultural hegemony of their own. Okay, so they're pushing back and trying to assert something. They have adopted the woke view. In fact, remember I said earlier that it's critical constructivism and the right is pseudo-constructivist or semi-constructivist. They've adopted the constructivist underlying premise that there is no value-neutral territory. Therefore, each group has to assert its values in order to promote them. And I would bet this commenter agrees with that. They're just, they're pushing back on the cultural madness, but they're also trying to assert a cultural hegemony. And they're not doing so in a way that is tolerant of other completely acceptable, and I'm not talking about pornography at this point, completely acceptable expressions. It's in fact a very rigid orthodoxy that they're pushing. So this is absolutely a mischaracterization, and it makes them sound good for themselves. And I wish I wish it was the case, but I mean, I don't want to make it personal, but after the year that I've had, like, anybody that would say something like that to me is either completely ignorant or drunk, like just high out of their minds, not paying attention, or as they might say, don't know what time it is. It's quite exactly the opposite of that. And the point is that while we don't want a society that's completely, anything goes, that's by no means the objective for anybody. There are going to be norms, and there are going to be values, and there are going to be, orientations toward virtue, which broadly means a civic theology. While that's all generally and certainly the case, we don't need some very narrow definition of the common good and then some, Praetorian guard that's going around and enforcing and making sure everybody's living up to it. It doesn't matter if it's, you think it's pro-civilizational values. The left thinks what they have are pro-civilizational values too. And it turns out that they're not. There has to be quite a degree of tolerance if you want a society that's free and high trust. But of course, tolerance has to also be limited within the boundaries of reason and reasonableness, which is not the same as reason. Like, for example, in law, we have a reasonable person standard. How would a reasonable person react to the situation? And the left, of course, has dissolved that completely. Well, the right is trying to make an extraordinarily narrow interpretation. That which shocks the conscience on the left should be nothing, and that which shocks the conscience on the right should be everything outside of a very narrow interpretation. Whereas, in fact, there's a whole lot of space where it's, I don't like it and I wouldn't do it, but it's not hurting anybody. Leave it alone.
Yes, James, I want to finish by thanking you for being here, but also we are going to be publishing this prior to your event in August, Saving American Liberty. Do you want to say a few words about that and what you've got in store?
Yeah, so Mike O'Fallon and Mike runs Sovereign Nations. He co-owns New Discourses with me. There's a conspiracy theory about that. There are a couple of them that are completely false. But we're putting on a conference in Dallas, Texas. The 22nd and 23rd. Check the dates. It's at the top of the New Discourses website. Yeah, but I'm jet lagged, so I might be off by a day. But I'm pretty sure it's 22nd, 23rd of August, Dallas, Texas, right by the airport. Very easy to get to. Very nice hotel. I mean, it's not a fancy hotel. It's just a comfortable hotel with good services. We did one there last summer. It was fantastic. Everybody loved it. And we're going to talk about kind of the big picture, right and left. So Mike is going to give a number of talks about the concept of integralism, and this is a philosophical school of thought. It derived from Catholic theology, but it's a political theory. It was implemented in different countries for better or for worse, depending on the situation. In Brazil, it was particularly tyrannical and militant, for example, and he's going to present what that's all about and, in fact, how it manifests in like the World Economic Forum, WHO, UN model is an integralist model on the left. But also there's a counter movement that is a neo-integralist model on the right. So he's going to present about that. I'm going to be talking about stakeholderism and also a lot of the things we talked about today. I'm going to talk about woke left and woke right, both in the 20th century and in the 21st century. So fascism as a reaction to communism or Marxism, and then woke right as a reaction to woke left, or if you prefer, neo-fascism, postmodern neo-fascism as a reaction to postmodern neo-Marxism. And then I'm going to try to articulate what it is, like I mentioned earlier, what it is we're actually trying to defend, which is a common sense based prosperity, where common sense is in the technical philosophical sense. So I hope people will come and check that out. The idea is to give a pretty big picture story of what's going on now with all of these big mass movements and how the woke right operates. If we had to have like a single theme, that the woke right is operating as the right hand of the left. And so it's just another instrument in this global move against all of us. So that gives you an easier way to think about it, is that the World Economic Forum, UN, WHO, etc., couldn't get their goals achieved directly. So now they're doing it through this right-wing reaction instead.
Wow, fascinating. And yes, it's the 22nd to the 23rd of August in Dallas, Texas. You'll find it on the website here, New Discourses. We'll put that actually on the screen rather than my little screenshot here. In the description as well below this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, Apple, wherever you're tuning in, look out for that. And also do check out James's work here on newdiscourses.com. James, this has been an illuminating conversation. Thank you so much. I certainly feel my understanding of this idea of woke right is very, very much tightened up now. Look forward to reading the comments on this one. And I don't know who we'll invite on to dissect your comments. Maybe we'll get Brett Weinstein on to talk about the response to today's discussion. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, and thank you for being here, and good to see you again. You're looking great. So onwards and upwards. And maybe I'll see you in August. I'll see what I can, see if I can get out to Texas, my first visit out there.
Well, that'd be fun. I would look forward to that.
All right, James, go well. Thank you so much. And you've been listening today to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. Do let us know your thoughts in the comments. I'm very interested to read them. As James said, we have to be careful about how deep we go into some of the comments and the rabbit holes that come from those. But I am genuinely curious to hear from you. So please let us know your thoughts and reflections on today's discussion. And maybe we'll be quoting you on our next episode here on the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. Thanks very much, James, and good night for now.
Thank you.
If what you've just heard has helped you to see our current moment more clearly, then don't let the conversation end here. Please share this episode and join the discussion in the comments. Our recent interview with Helen Pluckrose sparked a lot of debate on the idea of the woke right, and I'd love to hear your thoughts after hearing James's perspectives today. Do you think this is a real phenomenon or just a distraction from the bigger issues? Let's get the conversation going below. A huge thank you to James for bringing such depth and clarity to a subject that's shaping the future of our civilization. And remember, we're building a community of 1,000 podcast supporters to keep these conversations free from corporate sponsors, censorship, and political spin. If you believe independent voices matter, then join us today at danastingregory.com/donate. Your support isn't just keeping the lights on, it's helping to fuel a movement for truth, freedom, and human flourishing. Before we wrap up, James spoke powerfully today about how revolutionary tactics from Mao's China are echoing now in the West. Well, in our next episode, we go straight to the source with Isaac Stone Fish to expose how companies from the US and the United Kingdom are increasingly at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a story that's exploding right now, especially after Donald Trump called out the Dell CEO for bowing to Beijing, and you won't want to miss this. So hit subscribe now wherever you are watching or listening, and join us as we follow the money, the influence, and the agenda shaping the future of freedom. Until next time, my name is Dan Astin-Gregory. Live free and prosper.